This month is a webinar, which is run by the Institute for Democracy, Citizenship and Public Policy in Africa here at the University of Cape Town, in conjunction with the Democracy in Africa, run by Nick Chisman from Birmingham University in the UK. This month, we are fortunate to bring to you a stellar panel to discuss a topic that is, I'm very certain, likely to excite many of us, but also to make us willing to listen to the insights that the experts have for us today. And that is we are looking at African legislators. Are these MPs out of touch elites, or are they simply put upon servants? And to help us answer this question and provide insights from different perspectives, from different disciplinary backgrounds, but also from different countries, is a team of 4 speakers. Anja, Osei from University of Konstanz, Robert Metz from University of Strathclyde, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, Edalina Sanches from University of Lisbon, and Carlos Shenga from University of Joaquim, Chissano. And each speaker will have about 10 minutes or slightly above that in some cases to share with us their insights. And then afterwards, we are going to have questions from the audience. And to get the ball rolling, we'll start with Edalina Sanches, and then we'll move to Anja, Bob, and we'll end up with Carlos. I must, on behalf of my colleagues here at the Institute, including Matthias, who is running the show in the background, and Nick Chisman, I must express our gratitude that you found time to join us for this webinar, but more especially to the speakers making time to share their insights with us. At this point, I would like to invite Edalina to set the ball rolling. Edalina, all yours.
Thank you, Sishuwa. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for putting this panel together. Matthias, Nick, for the invitation, for the initiative, Anja, Carlos, Bob, for joining this discussion, and everyone else who is attending this seminar. Thank you all so much. I'll start, I'll now share my slides. My presentation is really, is a combination of some reflections and naturally some preliminary data, because the project I am running on constituency service in Africa and of course elite recruitment in Africa, but with selected countries, is still ongoing. And this is why I'm bringing some questions, some data, and then maybe and then complement with Afrobarometer data to actually help us raise some questions and lines of research. I will start discussing the issue of elites and representation, because the overall question that really guides us in this panel is really about representation, and then focus on one type of representation, which is descriptive representation, using preliminary data on Ghana, then substantive representation, looking at Afrobarometer data, which is not perfect for the purpose of actually measuring constituency service or substantive representation, but really allows us to explore the linkages between the citizens and the MPs. And then I will finish with some summaries, summary and open questions, which I think probably link with some of the data that I have present, but also some of the things that we actually intend to do after this data collection process is finished. So, the issue of elites and representation is really an old topic that political sociologists and political scientists have been studying this topic. Overall, the parliaments around the world tend to be elitist institutions, and studies since the 90s, if you look at Pippa Norris, for instance, in the British context, have seen that women, Black and the working class were really absent in terms of parliamentary representation. And even though there have been important strides in terms of women representation, overall the scenario is of a representation bias, which has not improved with time. Even with multiple rounds of elections, we see that there is this representation bias in Western or European parliament. This issue is really important because whether the parliaments are more or less demographically representative matters for the quality of representation of who the people in parliament are, but also the kind of stances and the kind of policies they design. So looking at parliamentary elites allows us to understand better how representation works and how the outputs of the recruitment process, which usually are the public policy. Another aspect related to representation is how well MPs are able to respond to the demands of the voters. This is actually more of a substantive way of handling representation, of studying representation. And we know that some MPs try to respond to these demands, but this task is really, subject to some incentives and constraints which vary in several ways. Whether MPs are able to represent or to be responsive to citizens' demands depends on the institutions that surround them, whether they operate in a setting that favors candidates or either favors more party-centered competition, whether they are able to please both their competing principles, the political parties, sometimes the selectorates, or instead the voters. MPs also face coordination issues in terms of whether they have budgets, staff, whether they have enough, which kind of tasks they will prioritize, whether the tasks in parliament or the tasks in the constituency, but it is also about the motivation and the career goals of the MPs. So substantive representation or constituency service really varies because some of these issues are really difficult to coordinate in terms of and really constrained or incentivized constituency service and the connections between citizens and the MPs. In the African context, the research is still in its infants when we compare to other regions, but still we can see that the last decade has been really rich one and vivid in terms of studies on political representation and elite. And one of the things that comes across more often is this idea that the resources that candidates bring to political parties in terms of local networks, supporters, patronage networks, but also money, all these eventually shapes descriptive representation, and also how local goods are distributed in the local constituency. Because if you look at the work that has been done on Ghana, Chissano and Nathan, for instance, argue that primaries are really mainly about local influent politicians who are particularly good not at representing the constituency, but at pleasing a small group of people within the constituency. In this sense, it's more like primaries function as a way of, as a system of maintaining patronage systems. There is high level elite circulation driven by narrow clientelism, by the ability of candidates or politicians pleasing the selectorates, but also by party strategies, because parties also try to remove those candidates that may threaten the existing power balances within the party. There's an overall trend of political continuity, sociologically speaking. in the sense that the elites that are in power have more or less the same sociological features and have been able to entrench themselves in state resources, and not only, but using the state as an arena for that, and to endure over time. In terms of more substantive issues, in terms of political linkage, as Barkan would say, or constituency service, it is structured by a set of networks linking politicians in parliament, but also local informants and citizens. This is a hierarchical structure, and it really flows from politicians to the citizens, as we will see with the use of Afrobarometer data. It is not usual to see this ongoing connection between citizens and MPs. But then, in terms of constituency service, studies that exist reveal that studies in the 70s, but more recent studies reveal that citizens tend to prioritize constituency service over other tasks, and they want their politicians to be more responsive. But MPs have different role orientations. Some of them tend to see themselves more as constituent servants, others more operate more as partisans. And this, of course, is related to the kind of institutional setting that operates within the countries that these MPs are from. Therefore, these two questions are really important. They are starting to be researched in different ways in the African, using data on African countries. I have some data to present to you in terms of descriptive representation using data on Ghana, and then I'll use some data on Afrobarometer data to present some information on the linkages between MPs and citizens. So in terms of descriptive representation, if we look at if we look at gender, we can see that the Parliament of Ghana is quite unbalanced in terms of gender proportion, with women being fairly below the representation mark, and if we consider the proportion of women according to the census, but also, and this is due not only to the unfriendly institutional setting, but also to gender norms, and of course to the fact that women are somehow left outside the clientelistic avenues that usually lead to the parliament. In terms of age, MPs on average have 48, 49 years, which is again in contrast with the census data, since at least 50% of citizens are below 30 years, and we can see that Ghana, as other African countries, has a very young age structure. So this data really reveals that the age structure is really biased towards older or middle-aged, particularly, and most often men. And this trend has not been reversed with time, so we do find the same kind of age profile regardless of the year that we are looking. In terms of localness, that is whether the MPs belong to the region and the district in which they are running for elections, the overwhelming majority of MPs tend to belong to the region and the district in which they are competing, which is again sometimes used as a proxy for analyzing the personal vote, the connection that the MPs have with their constituency. Another important variable would be whether the MPs have had a prior position at the local level, but we are still compiling this data, and the data that I have really underestimates this proportion. So this is why I didn't present it here, but we are collecting this data to help us map localness better. Because one of the hypotheses is that, of course, the importance of localness varies for varies with the institutional characteristics, with the nature of the electoral system as well. In terms of education, the majority of the MPs have more than the university degree. They have PhDs and masters. They have postgraduate degrees, and this is again in contrast with the overall population, as only 19% of the population, according to World Bank data, has more than post-secondary degree. In terms of education area, we can see the prevalence of business and administration as the areas as the education areas, and followed by social and behavioral sciences. And then some areas have lost some prominence over time, like education and engineering. But overall, it's interesting to see business with GIMPA in Ghana being very the stronger producer of these certificates, and then the University of Ghana, some of the universities that come across more frequently in the MP's biographies, and therefore contributing for the production of political elites in Ghana. Finally, in terms of professional background, as they are stated in MP's biographies, we can also see that some of them the majority of them are managers from different areas. And then we also have legislators, MPs who say that their last job was being a legislator, those that have been elected more than once. But we do find across sectors, like in health service, in education, in the education system, we do find managers, which means that as in other parliaments around the globe, the Ghanaian parliament is also one that is very elitist, where the ordinary citizen hardly finds any connection in terms of life trajectory and professional background, in terms of educational background, and this is important and has repercussions in terms of representation, and also descriptive representation and potentially substantive representation. Of course, it can be argued that it's not direct, that those that are in parliament would actually pursue a mandate to favor only their constituency. But the fact is that some studies show that there is a tendency actually to neglect certain issues where those that really care about that issue are not in parliament. Now, seeking to explore the relationship between citizens and MPs, I have selected only 3 indicators for the sake of time. The first indicator is about whether the citizens have contacted politicians during the past year, either to discuss a problem or to present their views. And we can clearly see that MPs are the least contacted among the 3 that I have data for. So local councillors are slightly more contacted, but you can see that the overall panorama is that 90% of the citizens surveyed by the Afrobarometer never contacted a politician to express their views, or because they have a problem they wanted to be resolved. And this is important because constituency service is really about that. And so, as you can see, this system of connections does not work from the bottom up to the MPs, and it would be interesting to understand why is it that citizens are not contacting their MP, and whether this varies between countries that, for instance, work with first past the post, and countries that operate with closed lists where the profile of the candidate matters less. In terms of the performance of the MP, we can see that over time, the way citizens see their MP as deteriorated. They have more pessimistic appraisal of MP performance over time. And in terms of who the citizens think is responsible for making the MPs accountable to their job, the percentages are more or less constant, but it's interesting to see that about 30% of only about 30% of the citizens really think that it is their job to make the MPs accountable. So again, is somehow transferring the responsibility to the in this case to the president and less so to the parliament and the political party. And this is important if we think that MPs mandate, if that MPs pursue different mandates and they respond to different principles. And in this case, citizens are really the key principle, and somehow they don't think that they should a part of them really don't think that this is their role to actually make MPs responsible for their role. In terms of summary, first, as I have presented before with the data of Ghana, we generally have these elitist parliaments, essentially composed of men, highly educated, from higher professional categories. This is, a representation bias, which I have said previously. The data on Ghana also show that parties recruit MPs with political credentials, such as legislators, but also those that are good at linkage. In this sense, we do have business professionals and managers, and this really insets this capacity of mixing recruitment criteria. We also find a match between supply and demand. The data hints at that. This is a mechanism that needs further research. We can see that the more resourceful candidates enter the fray, but also political parties have more incentives to actually select those candidates that bring the resources as well. The kind of questions that we are dealing with that we can cast and try to research with more data and try to see whether this data on Ghana really applies to other places is where do parliamentary elites come from? How do they sustain over time? What are the contemporary configurations of elite power? And what factors actually explain the patterns of elite recruitment and circulation? In terms of linkages between MPs and citizens, the data really reveals that the linkages are relatively loose with few bottom-up contacts. MPs are poorly evaluated, and we do find competing principles, but where citizens really shy away from a more active role. The kind of questions that we can raise and which we hope to answer with the data that we are collecting is among them are which factors explain its decision to link or to do constituency service, what type of service is more frequent and why, and how effective are the channels for citizen engagement with their MPs. And with this slide, I finish my presentation, and I look forward to hearing my colleagues in the panel. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Edalina. That's very, very fascinating stuff. We will proceed to Anja. Anja, are you ready?
Yes, I'm ready. I'll share my screen. Can you see the screen?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Okay. So thanks for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be with you on the panel. And it's also very good that Edalina was the first presentation because so you're already familiar with some of my concepts. You will see already that there's some linkages between our presentations, which tell us something about parliaments in general. But I decided to set a bit a different focus. So I will talk about MPs and their interconnections, not so much about MPs and constituencies, but it's all linked and you will see how these things come together. So actually, in African studies, we have this no institutions tradition, right? And informality and clientelism dominated the field, but formal politics has always mattered. Who is president, who is minister? So informal relations are connected to formal positions of power. And the renewed interest in institutions only began recently. So we see a lot of new research on parties, parliaments, cabinets, and constitutions, but we still have empirical and theoretical challenges. For example, there are some contradicting arguments on clientelism, which has been used to explain the stability and the breakdown of political systems with nearly the same arguments. We have some tensions with mainstream political science concepts. So what can we use, or what can travel to Africa and what cannot travel? We generalize from a few cases, and there is in general more need for systematic comparisons across regime types and regions. And I think this panel is also a very good starting point for this. Edalina already talked about representation, and I want to take this up, but I want to introduce you to sociological concepts of vertical integration and horizontal integration. So vertical integration means that elites are seen as representatives of their communities. And for the African case, we often assume that subnational elites gain access to state resources and in turn then deliver the political support of their communities. And then they use these clientelistic relations to redistribute resources to voters. There's also competition for these resources, and elites are often portrayed as extremely competitive, which they are, but also divided along ethnic, regional, religious identities and along party lines. So this perspective dominates the research interest. There's a lot of research on political clientelism, on voting behavior, and so on and so forth. And this has been very strong in African studies. On the other hand, there is the idea of horizontal integration, which goes back to elite sociology of the very, very early times, like Mills in 54, Domhoff, Putnam. So quite classic works, which claim that elites form dense networks across sectors. And their social relations lead to an easy intermingling, and they used to form a power elite. This is controversial, but this is one of the claims that some parts of elite theory are making. And then you have the work of Bourdieu, who also says that elites reproduce, or that elite reproduction runs through the educational system and by a common habitus. The perspective of horizontal integration of elites has not been very prominent in African studies, but the very classic text of Bayard has about 2 or 3 pages which talk about the reciprocal assimilation of elites. And he says that elites also form dense networks and diffuse in educational facilities, students' associations, churches, Islamic brotherhoods, mystical and occult associations, social clubs, and also by marriages. This perspective was neglected in research, but I was especially interested in this because this book by Bayard has been one of my great inspirations. Now, when we look at parliaments, there are classical functions of parliaments like making laws, oversight over the executive, and representation. And representation is somehow the vertical dimension of elite integration. So you can also look at it from the perspective of elite studies. And as Edalina, and I'm very happy that I just need to repeat it, you already know it, representation can be understood as descriptive or mirror representation. So the parliament should reflect the composition of the electorate and mirror all social or ethnic and whatever identities of the population. And there's substantive representation, which means that MPs should also act in the interest of their voters. Now, in my project, we are dealing with questions on who are the members of parliament. So we have a lot of questions on their biographies and career patterns, but also on their networks. So how do MPs interact with each other, and on values and attitudes. So the data that I'm presenting is not a full paper, but I'm jumping through the data a bit. The data comes from 2 projects. So I have MP surveys from Ghana, Togo, Sierra Leone, from Gabon, Benin, Cameroon, and Uganda. And we attempted at doing full surveys in the parliament, and in each of the countries we have very high response rates of over 80%. So we are of course not fully representative, but we come close at showing we come close at really showing what the profiles of MPs are. And here I can only also repeat and agree with Edalina. She was presenting on Ghana. And in general, across all the surveys that we did and across all the parliaments in different countries, so our countries are Anglophone, Francophone, different regime types, different levels of democracy, different institutional setups, but we found a very consistent result. So parliaments in Africa tend to be ethnically relatively representative, and there's no difference across the countries. The mean age is 50 plus. I think Edalina was saying 49 in Ghana recently. So yes, that also fits. So it's about 50 plus years. Most of the MPs are male. Women are underrepresented. Younger people are underrepresented, and the poor are totally underrepresented. MPs also tend to be highly educated, and many MPs have very long political careers. Nevertheless, and it sounds like a contradiction, the majority of MPs in our data set is in their first term. So there is a high elite turnover, but it's those who are coming also have made a career, whether in the party system or in other business sectors. So it's not that they are coming from nowhere, they are already part of the elite. So a bit more specific, I'm using Benin as an example. The mean age of MPs in Benin, the study was done in 2020, was 54.7, so 55 years roughly. 70% of the MPs that we interviewed have completed universities, so master degrees and higher. The Muslim population is slightly overrepresented, but nothing to worry about. And the representation of women in our data set is very low. And only 12% of the MPs are under 45. Yeah, so we already see that most of them are male and rather older. In terms of the representation of ethnic groups, you see that the distribution of ethnic groups in the country and in the data set, and you see that it's quite representative. And I could show you all the other countries. I'm showing Benin because in a country like, for example, Uganda or Gabon, we have a lot of ethnic groups and it becomes a bit incomprehensible when you look at the graphs. But I can tell you from what I know that most countries look like that. So in most countries, the representation of ethnic groups more or less matches the representation in the population. That changes when you break it down into political parties. So some political parties have strongholds in certain regions or among certain groups, but on the whole, ethnic groups are relatively well represented. Now, what is more, or what is, all of this is interesting, but what is also interesting is that MPs form very dense networks of political discussion and friendships in all countries. So I remember when I first went to Ghana, I was expecting a divided elite. And I was expecting a divided elite as well in Togo. But what I noticed was that there's a lot of exchange going on between MPs of different parties and of different ethnic groups, different regions. So all the divisions that I was expecting, I had to, I really had to rethink this. So in the next survey, we designed a question to know whether MPs had previous contacts with MPs, because I noticed that some people were telling me, yes, this person is my friend and I knew him from university, or we had been in business together. So we thought that we should look at this. And in our surveys, we have a couple of questions which measure how connected elites are. And one of them is, among the members of parliament in your country, is there anyone you knew before you became an MP? Please give me their names. And I was expecting to find some of these connections, but I was really surprised at the density. So in Gabon, 93% of all MPs that we interviewed, so we interviewed 111 of 134, and 93% of them have known at least one other MP before coming to parliament. And this was the first study of this series, so I thought maybe Gabon is a special case. No, it's not. It's 96% in Benin, 91 in Cameroon, and 92 in Uganda. So it's quite, although these countries are quite different, the figures are surprisingly similar. And these relations are formed in different sectors, for example, in politics, party membership, people have been members of the same party before, education, workplace, social relations, or family relations. And most importantly, these contacts cross ethnic and partisan lines. Here I'm just showing you some examples. So we asked people, who of the MPs in the parliament did you know previously? And then we also asked them to indicate the place where they met that person. And these are typical, most of them are now taken from Uganda just for language reasons. But for example, very frequently we went to the same university and did the same course. Or during a sports event in Douala, we grew up together, they were our neighbors. He's my uncle. We go to the same church, worked closely with him in private businesses before he was elected an MP. So you see that even before being a member of parliament, these MPs shared a social space. Yes, so living in the same neighborhood, you don't live with, when you know the structure of cities, sometimes you will see that, you know, there's social segregation and you don't live with random people in your neighborhood. The same with churches or universities. So these are already elite level contacts which happen in certain social spaces. Very interesting is also the prominence of family relations. Here I'm showing you an example from Gabon, and here the disclaimer is Gabon is a special case when it comes to family connections in the political elite. You might know that even the opposition leader Joaquim, there was, you know, in 2016, there was a conflict about the presidential elections. And even the opposition leader Joaquim is by family and kinship relations connected to President Ali Bongo. So he has children with Ali's sister. So this is quite a special case, but it's also interesting to illustrate what is going on. So in our data set, we have 50 of the 111 interviewed MPs who are connected to another MP by some form of family and kinship relation. So here you see, I just plotted it for you. I'm not going into the details of the network analysis, but what you see here is the MPs and their connections, and you see that MPs, so the colors are the political parties, and you see that family connections cross party lines. Yes, so it's not only that the ruling party is connected by family relations, but also the opposition. And in Gabon, this contributes to a lot of social cohesion and also to a system of co-optation of the opposition. Yeah, so you see that social relations produce a lot of interconnectedness. I could also show you the same plot and then plotting ethnic groups on it. And you would also see that family relations even cross ethnic boundaries. Now you see that MPs are quite densely integrated. So we have a lot of or even when you judge it from the perspective of comparative elite studies, I would say they are very densely integrated. And now what about relations to voters? So we heard this already in Edalina's presentation, and I think we will hear some more from Carlos. MPs believe that voters expect tangible benefits. So they have the perception that voters are interested in public and private goods. And MPs often promise to fulfill these, and they often promise investment in infrastructures that they really cannot fulfill. And this leads to a circle of disappointment, so into a circle of clientelistic promises that cannot be fulfilled, and this leads to disappointment and high turnover. An MP in Sierra Leone once told me that the expectations on the parliament are so high that constituents think that MPs are responsible for almost every development. And another one was telling me, this was also an interview from Sierra Leone, where I did a bit more qualitative studies, that everything constituents want, they will call the MP, like naming ceremonies, marriage ceremonies, they always call the MP and expect help and expect money. So MPs usually think that, you see that in comparative ways from 4 countries, that the provision of public goods is what their voters actually want. Sometimes also assisting them with personal needs, but development, provision of personal goods ranks very, very highly in all of the countries. So in fact, to conclude, MPs form clientelistic relations to their voters, or at least they think this is what their voters want, because we are here only looking at MPs' perceptions. But at the same time, MPs do not only have these vertical connections to their voters, they are also interconnected as a social group. They are demographically representative of attributes like ethnicity, region, religion, but not of gender, not of age, and not at all of social class. There is a shared social space prior to becoming an MP, and I would also believe that these relations that are formed previous to getting to parliament also help you to becoming an MP, and this is a thing that we need more research on. These relations cut across sectors and identity groups. The relations to voters are mostly clientelistic, but at the same time, MPs really form this socially integrated group. And I think this is something that research has not been taking up. So we need to bring ideas of elite integration or even notions of political class or ruling class back in. Interestingly, there are differences between the different countries, Anglophone, Francophone level of democracy, institutional setting, but to me, at least, the similarities of social cohesion and political elites are quite striking. I could also present you some of the differences, but when I look at it from a general perspective, I think MPs, political elites, are a very special kind of social group, and they are also connected to other elite groups and other elite sectors. And I think this is a dimension that we need more research on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anja. Clearly, representation also matters even for us here at the IDCPPA and Democracy in Africa. So having heard from 2 female presenters, we will now go to Bob and learn from the insights of Bob. Bob, are you there?
Yes, I am. Anja, can you disengage your screen so I can, yeah. Okay, can people see that?
It's just, you started sharing the screen, but at the moment it's There's nothing on it.
It might take a minute or two.
Okay.
And now?
Still blank. I can see the arrow. Maybe it's still coming.
Yeah, because it's telling me I'm screen sharing, but first.
Yes, it's showing. It says we are viewing your screen as well. Maybe to come along the way, perhaps you should go ahead.
Anything yet?
Nothing yet.
Please move this. It's paused. It's telling me the screen sharing is paused.
Yep, got it now.
Okay, great. Okay, so in opposition to the last two presentations, we take a slightly different approach of looking more at the substantive side of the representation and looking at issue representation. This is the first version of a paper that we have given at the ECPR Standing Group on Parliaments in Paris earlier several weeks ago. So it's a paper very much an evolution, so we appreciate any feedback. Yeah. So, and as the first two presentations have easily shown, and also made the similar arguments, is that I don't think it's an exaggeration to say almost all scholars of African legislatures and legislators view MPs through the lenses of neo-patrimonialism and patron-client politics. MPs are a slightly interesting exception in that at the national level, the MPs are the clients of big men presidents, party leaders, prime ministers, who are the patrons. But at the district level, the MPs are little big men. They become the patron, at least according to this framework, and develop, as Anja said, clientelistic relationships with citizens. But the viewpoint is that the exchange here is largely of material goods, mostly private or club goods, although the literature is also starting to move toward the position of saying that they're also interested in providing local public goods as well. But rarely, if ever, do scholars consider the possibility that MPs may be able or even interested in representing the interests of citizens. So the view to see citizens and MPs in a principal agent relationship is quite rare. So we considered what about the possibilities of seeing citizens in Africa as principals who instruct, or at least who are represented by their elected representatives. There are at least 2 or 3 different ways of answering this historically. Again, you're probably aware of the classic argument between Edmund Burke, who thinks that MPs ought to be trustees and other regarded and look out for their citizens and interests because of either their superior education or because they share the demographic interests, the demographic backgrounds of their citizens, and therefore are more likely to do the things that would benefit working class constituencies or certain ethnic constituencies. On the other hand, is the counter argument by the utilitarian philosophers Bentham and Mill, which says that MPs should listen or take instructions from or mandates from citizens, and this leads you into a different research tradition.
Sorry, Bob. Sorry, Bob. We have lost this. The screen is blank again, but you can go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I've got a very poor reception here. My screen keeps just popping in and out, even on my side.
We can just listen.
Okay.
Cheers.
So that leads you then where the trustee relationship really leads you to ask questions, as Edalina did, looking at demographic relationships and the demographic and social background characteristics of the MPs. The substantive, the mandate view, again, it directs you towards substantive representation and looking at the congruence of citizens and MPs in a range of issues, but specifically their policy opinions. And that's what we try and look at in this paper. So we take data from two different projects, the African Legislatures project, in which it gives us data about, at the national legislature level, variables about legislatures. We did surveys of random samples of MPs, mostly 50 with some exceptions across 17 countries. We did key informant interviews with legislative stakeholders, observations of committees, and a bill tracker, and that was done across 17 countries between 2008 and 2012. And then we combined that with data from Afrobarometer, which you're familiar with, I'm sure, with surveys of nationally representative random samples of citizens. That's been done in 8 rounds of surveys in as many as 36 countries, but we use round 4, which was done in 20 countries. But we use that because it was done in the same time period as the ALP study. So we end up combining data on the 17 ALP countries. So we have data both on MP attitudes and on citizen attitudes and opinion preferences. Specifically about one question. And again, I'm not sure if this is, if your side is keeping up with it or not, but the question is that's in both surveys of the MPs and of the legislatures, which is, in your opinion, what are the 3 most important problems facing this country the government should address? This measures perceived issue salience, and we look at the level of congruence of issue salience between citizens and representatives. What issues do they think are most important? Clearly, this is just one small element of the representative process. It's the first step in what Bingham Powell calls the chain of responsiveness. But it's an important starting point, and that's what we try and present some data. What we do is take the verbatim responses from the surveys of both citizens and MPs and categorize them into 12 or 13 broad categories. That's already been used in a paper by Amanda Clayton that was published in Comparative Political Studies last year. We build upon that, and that responses into people who cite agriculture or the economy or education or health or infrastructure or political rights, poverty, social rights, etc., as the most important problems affecting the country. And here we can say, I guess, Sishuwa, are these visible now, or is it still a blank page?
Table 2 is visible.
Oh, great. Okay. So this is an illustrative comparison across the 17 countries of the level of congruence between the percentage of MPs and citizens who mention each issue area. And so, for example, as you can see that both citizens and MPs are most likely to mention the economy as the most important problem affecting their country. There's just a 3 percentage point difference. It's astoundingly similar. At the same time, there are important gaps where citizens are more likely to cite infrastructure and poverty and water, where on the other hand, MPs are more likely to mention education, and also a big difference in MPs are much more likely to mention issues around political rights and political stability and democracy. But again, this is across 17 countries. It's useful for an illustration, but not much else. And once we break this down then to the country level, see if we can get that to move forward. Yes, so if you can see figure 1 in front of you shows a scatter plot of the percentage of on the left-hand side on the y-axis of MPs and the x-axis of citizens, the percentage of mention each issue area. And what you see is a very, very strong relationship that as citizens are more likely to mention a certain problem, MPs are also much more likely to mention that problem if we were just looking at the regression line in the middle as a slope. And if we count this either as whether people mention an issue once, they get 3 responses, or if they mention the total number of mentions out of those 3 responses, the relationship looks basically the same, that at least across 17 countries, you saw a very strong relationship. And then what we try and do is then to break this down by countries. So you just see some illustrations of what that relationship looks in each country. And that brings us then to the question about how we measure this, what statistic we use. We, in this paper, use the Pearson's correlation coefficient, which is drawn out of these scatter plots. There's been a lot of controversy over the years of others recommending using the slope of the regression line, but that also then leads you to the problem of having to use two statistics, the slope and the standard error. We've come across more recently in the literature a statistic called the probability density functions, and looking at the overlap of those two density functions and as a measure of congruence. And we think there's a lot of promise in possibly moving in that direction. But this is just to illustrate how we create our first dependent variable, which is the level of congruence in each country measured as the Pearson's correlation coefficient. And here you should be seeing figure 4 in front of you, which then gives you the level, again, level of congruence is measured by the correlation coefficient across the 17 African countries, and there's really very wide variation. Now, surprisingly, we have to admit our expectations were that the large list PR systems would have the lowest levels of representation, that MPs in Windhoek and Pretoria would be party hacks off a party list and don't go out to the country very much and would be very much out of touch. As it turns out, MPs in Namibia and in South Africa are very likely to cite the same problems as their citizens. The Francophone countries tend to be much lower, but also some single-member district Anglophone systems as well. So how do we understand this congruence and this variation in congruence? Just moving up to the next page. So what, and again, the two things, this is the first draft of the paper. It's the first exploration of some of the sources of difference. But we also were aware that we only have 17 cases at this country level of analysis. So we really can't overload the analysis with many variables. So we tried to actually consciously select a few to start with. And so we take 3 structural system level variables and ask whether, for example, are countries with longer histories of democracy more likely to have higher levels of congruence? Does the electoral system make a difference? And does the breadth of the party system as measured by the number of effective political parties, does that matter? We then look at 2 variables at the level of the MP or the assembly, the MPs in the assembly, and ask about the average level of seniority or experience. So are more experienced legislatures more likely to be representative? And then we also look at role orientation, as that's already been mentioned in previous presentations. Do assemblies with higher proportions of people who see themselves as having a linkage function, are they more representative? And lastly, then we look at one citizen level issue is, does the aggregate level of citizen contact with MPs, does that also bring about higher levels of substantive representation? Just to show you a few of the significant variables at the bivariate level, we found a strong difference in an electoral system. Figure 5 that you should be seeing right now. And again, this is really a surprise to us that the large list PR systems, South Africa, Namibia, Mozambique, which are in the middle, do a very good job in terms of representation of congruence measured in this way. The worst are the Francophone multi-member districts that use proportional representation, but generally in small districts. We also found a significant bivariate effect looking at seniority. So legislators where the average member was serving a second, and like some of the previous presentations, we found that the median representative across Africa was only in their first term. But in places like Namibia, Kenya, and South Africa, where the average legislator was in the second or somewhere between the second and a half term, levels of representation were higher, of congruence. We also found a strong role of role orientation, where there's a larger proportion of MPs who see themselves that their most important function or the most important role is in terms of constituency work or representing citizens. You had higher levels of congruence as well. And then lastly, in terms of citizen contact, which should be figure 8. I'm just trying to get this to advance. The small dotted line suggests that there's somewhat of a relationship, but not a whole lot of a difference in the slope of that line across across the 17 countries. But once we then looked at only the single member district countries, which is the more heavily black dashed line, found a much stronger relationship. So in countries that use single member districts, it really matters the level of extent, the level and extent of contact between citizens and MPs seems to make a big difference in whether MPs have the same issue salience as ordinary folks. We then just display a regression table, a very minimalist regression table, trying to look at those packages of variables simultaneously and find basically, again, when you look at the three model one, the three structural variables, the electoral system makes a difference. When you just look at in model two, the MP related factors, its role orientation and average term length seniority make a factor. But then across all citizens, all countries, citizen contact is not statistically related. So I'll direct your attention just to the last two models. And again, the number of cases is quite low, but what we did was split the sample, model 5, looking at those countries that use PR either at the national or at the small multi-member districts. And we find amongst those countries, it's the average term length which matters. Seniority is the most important variable. But then amongst the 9 countries that use single member districts, citizen contact was by far that had the strongest impact on increasing the level of congruence. Now, to finish up, this level of analysis has been at the collective, looking at collective representation of the legislature as a whole and the citizenry as a whole. But an equally important approach views representation at the dyadic level, at the level of the electoral constituency. So we have been trying to put together the Afrobarometer samples and the ALP samples and identifying citizens who live in areas represented by the people we interviewed in the ALP samples. It's been a very complex process, trying to geocode these constituencies and overlap them. That Matt has been doing a tremendous amount of work with, and we've been able to then get data on constituencies in Lesotho and Malawi. And there you find, there are the constituencies, and here we measure congruence slightly differently. For each citizen, we ask how many of the things they mention are also mentioned by the MP. So the score could go from 0 up to 3. So if the 3 things you mentioned are also mentioned by your MP, you get a score of 3. Other people get a score of 0. And these are the average scores in each district. Again, these are districts that at least have 16 representatives. So we threw away the districts that had much fewer citizens and respondents in them in the Afrobarometer surveys. And again, you should find really big differences in the congruence of specific MPs and the specific representatives as measured by Afrobarometer surveys. Now, what makes the difference there? Ultimately, we'd like to replicate the analysis at both levels, but what we've been able to at least do so far, by varied analysis, again, there's only a limited number of constituencies to explain, but in both Lesotho and Malawi, MPs who on the left-hand side say that they're in a key role, their key job is defined as constituency work or representation. They have far higher levels of congruence than the people who say that their most important job is to write legislation or to do oversight. That's true in both Lesotho and Malawi. So that's a nice, mirrors up with what we found up at the national level. And lastly, we also then look at the time allocation. So the ALP surveys also ask citizens, MPs to tell us what proportion of their time as an MP is given to things like, sorry, I just slipped over that. I'll try and back up to that slide. What proportion of their time is given to constituency work, party work, plenary work, committee work, as well as their other jobs. This is the percentage of time the MP tells us they spend on constituency work. And again, we find a notable relationship that where MPs will spend more time on doing constituency work, they have, in both countries, have a much better idea of what their citizens think on this public opinion question than those MPs who spend time doing other things. So some tentative conclusions then. again, we have a limited number of cases, both in terms of countries and MPs and constituencies. We've used a limited number of just one simple indicator about issue salience congruence, which is really just the first step in the chain of responsiveness. Yet we've been able to, I would argue, develop a meaningful measure of substantive representation, issue salience congruence, which varies across countries and across constituencies within countries in very meaningful ways. And so we've identified the importance of electoral systems, the role orientation of members of parliament, and the impact of citizens in terms of their individual level participation in making representation work. So what this really means, I think, is that scholars of African politics need to look much more at the relationship between legislators and voters in terms of representation, in terms of issue preferences, and not just the exchange of material goods. Where do we go from here? And the next steps, in terms of finishing this analysis of substantive representation, we clearly would want to look at other variables and additional cases. We also want to experiment with other measures of measuring representation beside the Pearson's correlation coefficient. We also then want to extend the analysis, and this we'll be doing through work with Carlos and Edalina and Anja on the extent of descriptive representation across these same samples. And hopefully then we'll be able to create a much more holistic picture of representation across Africa. And I'll leave it right there and we'll anticipate your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bob, for those fascinating insights. We'll end our webinar in terms of the speakers with Carol's insights from Mozambique. Carlos, it's all yours.
Thank you, Anja. I don't know whether you can see my screen.
We can.
Well, let me look for my video. I cannot find it right now. Okay, fine. Thank you, Sishuwa. I'm going to talk about how well legislators represent citizens' concerns in Mozambique, and they're going to do that looking at the 6 indicators that measure the concept of representation. It's much more descriptive rather than having advanced statistics. So let's see, why it's not moving? Okay. So you can see this slide, right? Number 1.
Yes, we can.
Yeah. So the first indicator that I use to measure representation is roles orientation, which has to do with how legislators view their role of being an MP, where they view it much more in terms of making laws, overseeing the bureaucracy, or representing constituents. So to analyze this, I use the African Legislature project data from 2008 that surveyed 50 Mozambican MPs. So there are questions that were asked related to orientation. The first one was, which role brings you the most satisfaction? And the response categories were debating bills and passing laws, making policies by writing laws, overseeing the executive, and also some other items related to constituents, like bring development to your or their constituency, represent constituency views in parliament, and assist constituents with their own problems. The second question was, which of the following jobs is the most important being a legislator? And the response categories are the same. So the result of this is that 52% majority of Mozambican MP view their role, view constituency service has the role that brings most satisfaction. And also the same 50% say with respect to the most important job of being an MP. So this is the first finding that African MPs, in this case Mozambican, put on the people that they serve. On the third item on role orientation, which is when you take a position in a parliament, which is the following is the most important, whether it's much more the view of the political party, their political parties, or their party leaders, the view, their own view, national interest, or the view of their constituents. So the results shows that majority, when they take position, they follow much more the partisan view, the view of their political party or the party leaders, rather actually following the view of their constituents. This high level of Mozambican MPs following much more the position of their political party might be related to the electoral system of a party list. So the MP have much more connection with their political party bosses rather than with their constituents, because in a voting process, voters vote for the political party rather than voting for individual MPs. So this is the first evidence on the first two questions. The first evidence that Mozambican MPs put up on 7th, but the third item showed that they are much more elitist group rather than being attached to their to the people that voted for them. The second item that measure representation is policy preference, whether there is a match or congruence, as Bob was saying, whether there's a match between the policy preference of legislators and the preference of the citizens. So to analyze this, I bring Afrobarometer data. Since ALP data is from 2008, so I bring also 2008 Afrobarometer data that ask the same question to citizens and MPs, which is what is the most important problems facing this country that the government should address. So here I bring only the first response, because there's a second and a third response also. And by looking at these bars, we can see that there's no match. Like we see, while MPs are much more focused on a policy preference, reducing poverty, citizens are much more saying that we would like the government to reduce unemployment or create more jobs. So in a descriptive, much more descriptive way, rather than using correlation or more statistics, I would say here that there's no congruence or there's no match between policy preference legislators with policy preference of citizens. So these are the first two items of representation looking at individual level. The other four items that I bring, they are much more related to institutions. So viewing representation by looking at the institution, at parliament itself. So I bring who is who in the Assembly of Republic in Mozambique data, and I look at this relationship connecting descriptive representation, which has to do with the extent to which how the parliament or the MPs mirror the demographic composition of people, and also substantive representation that looks at whether MPs actually represent the interests of people, of citizens. So these are the results from a study that I conducted for the first three multi-party assembly from 1995 till 2009. And I bring here women and youth and compare with citizens at large. We can see that the Mozambican parliament is quite high in terms of women representation. So the average is 32%. And there's some improvement over time from the 4th to 6th assembly. But this level is still low if we compare with citizens at large. 32% is quite high if we compare Mozambique with other parliaments in terms of women representation, but it's still low. It's like the women aspect doesn't match, doesn't mirror the Mozambican population if we look at the National Institute of Statistics data. And moving to youth, there's only 8% of youth MPs in Mozambican parliament, but when we look at society, Mozambican society is mainly young population. But yeah, the descriptive representation thing is that it's difficult to make or to expect that parliament going to reflect the demographic composition of the population in certain indicators. This because the job of being MP requires a high education and I don't know, male tend much more to take it to be in politics rather than women. And when women in Mozambican case are in politics, are in parliament, is mainly by being enlisted in a PR system rather than being there by on interest. But yeah, this is something debatable. Moving to substantive representation, we have in Mozambican parliament a women parliamentary group. Also, we have youth parliamentary group, but these two parliamentary groups, they never initiated a bill that focus on women or advanced women issues or advanced youth issues. So in terms of the substantive representation, at least looking at the women and youth, I would say that it is quite low or doesn't exist at all. The fourth aspect of representation has to do with the rules of procedures and structure for representation. It's like, if we want MPs to represent their constituents, we need that the parliament includes in its rules of procedure and structure aspects of representation. So one of the things that I've looked at is whether the parliament is open for citizens and their organized group to make claims, complaints, and petition when citizens feel that their rights have been subverted by the in Mozambican parliament in its standing orders, it has this openness, at least it is in the standing order. But also it's important that there's a structure for petition, because something is to have in a standing order in a legislation, but the other thing is to have a structure that deals with petition. In Mozambican context, there is a committee system. The petition are made analyzed at committee level rather than at plenary level. And at plenary level, the need of having the bit of petition, and in Mozambican context also there is a petition committee. And the last thing on rules and structure for representation is the constituency service program. So there's something that says during interim period, Mozambican MPs have to leave the capital seat where parliament meets and go back to their constituencies, and they will do some work there, etc., etc. So all these at least exist in Mozambique and function somehow. On the fifth aspect is the effectiveness of civil society attendance in a public hearing. So here, one thing is whether civil society is allowed to participate in the committee meetings. So sometimes the committees, when they are reviewing a bill, they open itself to hear citizens, the organized group, or civil society in general, and they try and influence the lawmaking process. So this is something that exists, but the other thing is how, when the civil society are allowed to participate in a public hearing, they are effective in participating. So here I look at whether civil society organization can make their own recommendation, or they manage to insert their inputs in the bills that are reviewed at committee level. So I rely on ALP bill tracker data, and this is the data that I collected a few years ago. It shows that civil society inputs to bill reviewed by committee is at the level of 0.4% only. Well, at least it exists, because there's always that view that African parliaments are rubber stamped, but it's not the case of Mozambique and many other other parliaments, but that level of civil society making inputs to bills that are reviewed to committee are quite low, 24%. And when we look at this over time, we see a declining trend from the beginning of multi-party system until 2009. The last aspect has to do with effectiveness of citizens and the organized group to make claims, complaints, and petition. I created something called MLP, which is Mozambican Legislature project. It's much more focused on in Mozambican context. So when citizens are allowed to make petitions, so how effective they are. So I created this measure of effectiveness by looking at whether those petitions get a feedback from the parliament or from the committees, because people submit and organized groups submit the petition to parliament, and what happened next? Does the parliament do anything? What is the feedback? So I looked at whether those petitions get response. Normally by response is something like the committee approach. If it's, let's say, Minister of Justice is subverting citizens' rights, so the committee approached the Minister of Justice and say that, look, we got this petition, says this, what you have to say about this. Sometimes the ministry changed its view and open up to that group of people or to the citizen. So is that what I mean by responded? But not always they respond by response means at least there's a formal response that the committee draft to the applicant and say that your case was dealt in this or that way, or is still in the process of being reviewed. This is the data that I found is a little bit difficult to find this information. I was so lucky that I got this from, was it SUNY project in Mozambique by State University of New York. Yeah, they had a program with Mozambican Parliament. So when they left, I managed through the manager of the project, I managed to get that data, but until 2004, after 2004, that information doesn't exist because no one collects this data. So the level of responded or effectiveness was 15% in the first parliament, a multi-party assembly, and it improved to 45%. Yeah, but those numbers of petitions that were responded are quite low. Like in 2001, the 93% was only out of 24 petitions submitted. So the number of petitions, they are quite low. Now, those numbers have been improving so much, but I don't know to what extent the parliament have been responding to them. So in terms of summary, how well legislatures represent citizens' concerns in Mozambique, or in general, I would say that they do so if their role orientation is much more of constituent servants, their policy preference match with those of voters. When both there is descriptive and substantive representation, which is a little bit difficult in terms of descriptive. In terms of rules, structure for representation, where there's openness for citizens to make petition, the structure for petition exists, constituents program exists, civil society managed to incorporate inputs in bills reviewed by committees, and the committees are also responded to petition. In this case, Mozambican case, the conclusion are mixed. I found that in the two items measuring role orientation, the MPs put up on servants, but in the other two, that include also policy preference, they don't. And the rest has to do with the indicators that measure representation that have nothing to do with the MPs themselves. They are not at the individual level, but at the institutional level. It's like whether there's a descriptive or substantive representation, rules and structure for representation, and the two effectiveness. Yeah, when I was elaborating this presentation, I was a little bit afraid of timing, and I'm sure that we are above the timing. But yeah, there's also a question that tap representation, and this is at individual level, which is where the legislators travel to their constituency in terms of number of days that they stay there. In Mozambique, they travel at least 90%, travel at least once, and they stay 30 days up to 90 days, yeah, in terms of duration of their stay and what activities they perform there. 30% say that they listen to constituents. 26% they say that what they do is mainly attending party meetings, and another 26% talk to groups and hold meetings. So that is all for me, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Carlos. We have run out of time, but we could extend this for 15 minutes so that we can have a set of questions from the audience, and then we can close it at 6:45. So perhaps we should have one set of questions so that the speakers could address them at once, and you could either raise your hand or simply put your question in the chat box. I'll start with the Gretchen.
Yeah, hi, thank you very much. And hello to Anja, Edalina, and Bob. So 2 very quick questions. The first one is that no one answered the question in the title, the very provocative question in the title of the webinar. And so I would love to hear what they all have to say about that. And then the second quick question is, what exactly the role of the MP is. So for example, my impression is that in Ghana, it's not actually constituent services, right? I mean, back to the whole idea of lawmaking, policy making, overseeing the executive, although that's also very challenging. So where does it say, what the role of the MP is? Is that in the Constitution? African countries contrast with the United States, where, for example, constituency services is highly developed, right, as a role of the legislator. So that's my second question. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question. Nick, are you there?
I am here.
I know you have very good questions for the panelists.
I was going to own up to Gretchen. Actually, I came up with a question in the title. So, so I guess, going back to Gretchen's excellent question, I've done a lot of work qualitatively, I suppose, on this and looked at the great ALP data. And, it's always seemed to me that, that there's an interesting set of 3 competing roles. There's those MPs who do try and spend quite a lot of time in the chamber. They're a smaller number, but they are there and they do try and play some of that scrutinizing role. Then there's those MPs, who do try and focus a bit more on public goods. And then there's those MPs who focus more on private goods and club goods. And those 3 things overlap for all MPs, but MPs weight them a little bit differently depending on what their constituents demand, and also what and also on their personal preferences. I think the thing that I wanted to ask, then this is the sort of question. So in the book that we published, The Moral Economy of Elections, we get MPs and citizens to talk about the interaction around elections. And what citizens and MPs both kind of say to us is that, short-term things like throwing money at us around elections doesn't work. Both MPs and citizens recognize that that's pretty ineffective way. And what they both talk about is actually what works and is successful for political mobilization is a long-term sustained relationship of care. And it's that sustained relationship that transfers the transfer of money or club goods or private payments into something that has moral authority. And Paul Nugent's written on this, for example, in the Ghanaian context. So I wanted to ask them a little bit about, you know, what is it that gives MPs kind of moral authority? What is it that turns all this into a currency that MPs can use at the ballot box? Is it, you know, Stefan Lindbergh's argued that Ghanaians, for example, want club goods over public goods and private goods. Others are typically given the framework that Bob set out at the beginning, which is more patrimonial and it's more about the private goods. But I'd like to see people being, you know, we've talked about different kinds of relationships, but we haven't really talked so much about different types of services and different forms of exchange. And I'd like people to speak maybe a bit more specifically about what kinds of forms of exchange are seen as legitimate and generate that kind of moral authority in the places where they work, and does that vary across these countries and within these countries?
Thanks, Nick. Rashid?
Oh, hello, everybody. So I actually just got back from Ghana a week ago doing field research. I was interviewing MPs, and most of the MPs, this I think would be a follow-up to what Gretchen and Cheeseman just said, actually. So they do mention that their role is actually, first of all, to make laws. Nowhere in the Constitution is it required for them to provide services to the people. And nevertheless, they tend to take that role very seriously. So in a way, they've actually adopted this role of providing service because, well, they think it is important for them to do so. Even though in almost all the interviews, they would mention that development and, you know, service provision is under the jurisdiction of the district chief executives or the MCEs. But then the people say, well, we didn't vote for those people, we voted for you. So how do you reconcile this discrepancy, right? Because the Constitution does not require them to do so, but somehow they've adopted this role, and somehow the people also expect this role from them. And so in a way, it's becoming a new role that is not in the Constitution, but somehow it's been institutionalized. And so they have to do that. But so how do you reconcile this whole discrepancy with, you know, the literature? And also about the topic of this discussion, most of the MPs tend to think that they're very much accessible. Most of them think they receive contact. Some mention that they receive contacts more than 10 times a day from their constituents. Sometimes they're on a phone call and there are several phone calls coming in. And so, but then the data is also telling us that less than, I don't know, 10, 15% of the population contact their MP. So from the perspective of the people, when we look at the data, we think people are not contacting their MPs enough. But when you speak to the MPs, they think they're receiving way too many contacts, to the point that they might not even have time. Some of them do not even go to the chamber sometimes because they're overwhelmed. So, you know, this discrepancy, how do you tie this whole discrepancy to the, you know, discussion?
Thank you. Thank you, Rashid. If I may throw a final question before the speakers come in, maybe two. One is there a role for history here in relation to maybe those countries where which had a history of one-party rule, where the MP, for example, was an agent of development, like in Kenya, even though it wasn't necessarily the case in Zambia. Do we see some variations that emanate from that kind of history? And I think that the other thing is a question that Gretchen mentioned earlier about the Constitution, because the other, in cases like, in places like Zambia, for example, you need to be an MP, you need to be of a particular age, for example, and that may feed into, Edalina, into the kind of lower representation that you spoke about connected to age. Also, when it comes to education, it's a requirement in some constitutional example that you need to have a certain level of education. So that already kicks out a number of people who may not have gone to school. In a sense, actually surprising, because during the colonial rule, this was criticized as elitist, for example, by African nationalists, and say we don't want, it should be one man, one vote, for example, at voting level. But what we are seeing now is that pushed into into the constitution when it comes to who can become the MP. So I wondered if maybe you could also speak about these variations that are informed by institutional barriers that as feeding into the representation idea. Thank you. I don't think we have questions in the chat, but okay, there's one here who says, could you please ask Bob or anyone else that if indeed MPs we spend more time doing constituents work are more likely to win elections, how is it that in Africa we still complain about MPs being more loyal to their political party than their constituents? I think that is for all the speakers. So I would request, if you don't mind, that we go through the order in which we were speaking, starting with the Edalina.
Well, thank you all for your question. I tried to write them all. So thank you, Bob, Gretchen, Rashid, and Sishuwa, and all of you that have raised questions. So yes, so the first one, we missed the question of the webinar, out of touch elites or puts upon servants. I think we didn't miss it completely. To some extent, our data really shows that there is some level of connection, but it also shows that there's a lot of variation. There is a lot of variation in that connection. I think that the dichotomizing is really difficult when MPs actually engage in different roles and face a lot of constraints, and there's a lot of variation at the institutional level, at the individual level. And so it's difficult to give a yes or no question. What we see here is degrees of representation, degrees of constituency service, because some of these concepts are better understood in a spectrum rather than as a dichotomy. This is what I would say, based not only of what I've heard my colleagues say here today, but also some experience I have had also interviewing MPs from different countries. And to that extent, I would say that, of course, constituency service may be more relevant in certain countries than in others. And the existing data, I mean, Bob, Carlos and Matthias, your work has really shown that there is some MPs that really see themselves primarily as constituency servants rather than legislators, and this is related to the kind of institutional setting and electoral context that they also have. So there is a lot of variation, and there are instances where political parties are willing to cut, those MPs that really underperform or they don't, and studies on Cameroon have shown that as well. But also cases where political parties really prefer to keep those MPs that bring resources to the party. So in a way, we have a mix of strategies and a mix in terms of the roles that the MPs actually implement. What is interesting is to observe what are the variations that exist not only at the country level, but also at the individual level, because some of the data really show that there's a high, even in the same country, there's a high proportion of MPs that really do seem that do carry out, value the role of constituency, of being constituency servant. And so if that is the case, then even within the single country, there is this variation that is worth exploring. So I'll rather reply the question in a more nuanced and a more of a spectrum way, rather than just a yes or no question, because we will find, even in a single country, differences of focuses that vary, not only vary at the district level, at the individual level. So it's not only a matter of politicians having different incentives, but we also see that it depends sometimes of the marginality of the district, or whether it is central. So there's a lot of variation still to be explored. I feel like from interviews I conducted in Cabo Verde, I saw that the kind of exchanges that give MPs that really give MPs this morality is when they bring infrastructures when they bring infrastructures is when a politician is connected with particular goods that were implemented in that region. I remember someone telling me, in a rural area, if you bring, a hospital or a nursery, this will make a huge difference. People will never forget it, because then women will come, they will be able to have certain cares. So there is a lot this, and this is important because some of the data really also speaks about infrastructure. So in a way, even if MPs cannot actually implement those kind of policies, in some countries they can implement, they have constituency development funds. It is the case of Ghana. It is the case of other countries that they have, even if they don't utilize, as George, I think it was the paper by Osei that really showed that they don't really utilize a lot of their constituency development funds. There's a lot of problem there as well. But this is to say that in some countries, the constituency service is also followed up by a set of mechanisms to really make this task somehow viable. Of course, it's not as developed as in the US, with staff, with resources, with a lot of budget. But this is to contextualize that. I mean, some strides have been taken, and about I'll give voice to the others immediately. I don't think I need to answer them all, but going to Rashid's question on how they reconcile their role and how they try to do both. I think as I was trying to see to advance in my presentation, I feel that somehow MPs face a series of constraints, and one of those constraints is their role orientation, which one they want to pursue. And of course, this depends on whether they think their role is more, who is their principal, whether they think it is the constituency or the constituents or the political party or the selector or the local party branch. So this depends, and this varies a lot. And of course, in certain countries, you will find that MPs will value their connection with the constituents. And from what I understood, the more autonomous is the local party branch, and the more autonomous is the MP, the more they will be able to, be responsive to the constituent, because then if they break away from the party, they are able to, build their own constituency there and build their own basis of support. So the more they have their own resources, the more they will be free from their competing principles. And you said something also, Rashid, very important about the phone calls and the messages. When I was interviewing an MP in Cabo Verde, he actually told me that. So I have a wire in the countryside and is calling me every day and from time to time and telling me what is happening. So even when it's not constituents that are directly calling the MP has a local informer that is watching the situation and collecting the demands, so to speak, and then transmitting them back to the MP. And I think, of course, there's a role for history, Sishuwa, and a role for looking at institutional variation and all those aspects that help us frame this analysis, because we're not looking at individuals per se, but also when we look at the patterns of elite formation, we do find this connection with prior political eras, and we also find the importance of formal rules for the shaping of the requirements of the settings of the kind of the power and of the accountability systems. And this is it, sorry, so I can give voice to the others. Thank you so much for the question, really, really interesting.
Thank you so much, Edalina. Anja?
Yes, thank you for the questions. I don't know where to start. There's so much. So for the title, Out of Touch Elites, from my perspective, or what I was presenting today, I would definitely say yes, because today I was presenting data on the class stratification, so on the social stratification. And from that perspective, I would say yes. MPs live in their own world. They live in the world of political elites. When they get elected, at least in the countries that I'm working in, they will move to the capital city. And then they go back to their constituencies from time to time. We also collected those data. So MPs go back from, some live in the constituency, some go very frequent, some stay long. So we have to look at all these variations per country. But from my perspective, from the perspective of elite sociology, I would really say yes, somehow they are out of touch. But then, of course, if you are too much out of touch, you are not re-elected. So there's a role conflict. What does the MP do? Does he stay in the capital city where he has his Toyota pickup truck and the special credit lines that they have, and then they build a nice house, they bring their families? Do you live that life, or do you reconnect to your constituency? And many voters really want to see their MPs. So even seeing the MP, knowing that he or she is in the constituency is of some value. But then it starts. MPs that I interviewed in Sierra Leone were all complaining, like, yeah, when I go to my constituency, I cannot even go to my house. People come knocking on my door. And so people will bring their demands. From the perspective of the MP, this is a lot of demands. Even 20 are a lot, but maybe 20 people, if you look at it, it's a tiny part of the citizenry who will actually attempt to talk to the MP. So MPs are in a constant role conflict. Do I take my job as lawmaker serious, or do I go often to the constituency? Some will then decide according to their financial assets. If I have a lot of money, like Lindbergh was finding, I will go back to my constituency. If I don't, I cannot. Yes, and I totally agree with Edalina that these private goods tend to cancel each other out. We have a small side project on party primaries, and we find that party delegates say, yeah, all the candidates have given me a small bribe and I take all of it and then I vote for what I like. So these small private goods, people take it, but there's no guarantee that they actually garner votes. So what is more important is this big things, infrastructure, bring a hospital. But that then adds into the role conflict, because the MP will promise at elections, yes, if you vote for me, you will have a hospital, you will have a road. These promises, he cannot fulfill it. So this role conflict also produces what we see as high turnover, because people are trying to outbid each other in promising things that as MPs they cannot deliver, because that's national development. Not every MP can bring a road to his constituency. It's just not possible. And so there's, on both sides, there's a lot of frustration. And then people vote MPs out. And here we have to also think about the role of the party. There is just upcoming research on the role of parties and primary elections. And I think that's really interesting, because there is a lot of variation. So how can voters punish MPs that are not performing? In some areas, there is no competition between the parties in some constituencies, but within the parties. Yes, so that's then a different logic. At election campaigns, it's already decided if you are running for a seat in a stronghold of your party. So we also have to look at the party level. And then at institutional variation, I skipped that because for what I presented today, for the social cohesion, I didn't find any differences between the countries, but there are differences at other levels. And we're also having a side project on this. So we need more work on institutional variation. But what I can tell you is that parties are crucial for re-election. So what we see in our data, I'm beginning to write a paper on Uganda, is that it's not just how many times you have been to the constituency, but it's actually the connections that MPs are building in their own party, because parties seem to matter a lot. They seem to matter much more than literature is actually understanding at the moment. And so party connections matter for re-elections and party connections at the local level. So we are seeing some interesting data on who MPs actually have as contacts as the local level. And it seems, I'm exploring that, but it seems that local parties matter also for, you know, the type of constituency service and the perceptions that the electorate has. But on the other hand, the countries that I'm working in, for example, Gabon, Togo, we don't have enough data on the party system. So there's also a big void that we have to, a big gap in the literature that we have to fill. But I believe that local networks, local parties matter for re-election and also for how voters perceive the performance of their MPs. I stop here. And I hand over to Bob.
Yeah, Gretchen, thanks for the question, and I'll mention, come back to Nick's question as well. There's a series of contradictions or dilemmas here. I think better to express as contradictions. These people are an elite. They are much older, much more male, professional from business backgrounds, much more educated than the average citizen. So in that sense, they're out of touch. At the same, they also misperceive what citizens want. The average MP across our 17 countries and within most countries are most likely to say, my most important job is to deliver goods to the constituency or to individuals. Citizens, on the other hand, are most likely to say the most important job of the MP is to come and listen to me and represent my views in Parliament. So there's this interesting misperception of what it is that citizens want. At the same time, I think the data we presented today in terms of issue preferences shows that MPs are pretty aware of what their constituencies want in terms of the public agenda. Whether that translates into public policy is something else that we need to take our research another couple of steps further. At the mass levels, MPs are certainly highly recognized. For the comparative data I've been able to look at, Africa has some of the highest levels of name recognition. You go into Malawi, the average of Malawi and rural Malawi, off the top of their head could tell you who their MP is, much higher than developed countries. At the same time, in South Africa, only 1% can because of the effect of the party list. Who their MPs are, they have high levels of expectations, and the levels of contact really are, I think, quite high comparatively. Whether they're put upon, I think in terms of the linkage function, they really are. They work very hard. They travel home, and in most single-member districts, the median MP goes home every weekend while the Parliament is in session, and while Parliament is not in session, they spend long periods of time in their districts, often traveling long distances and encountering a large degrees of personal costs, and also spending a lot of their money in terms of these help for personal conditions. But I think that's one of the things we miss, and people would do well to read Richard Fenno's work in the United States in the 1960s and 70s. And just because MPs spread money around doesn't mean that's all they do. They may do that to meet certain ends. They do casework, they do constituency work. That doesn't necessarily mean they don't also try and do significant degrees of representation. At the same time, this comes as a trade-off. The more time they're doing that, they can't do lawmaking, they can't do oversight. So that's very true in terms of being put upon. But I think these certainly aren't people who are sitting around with lots of time on their hands. In terms of Nick's question, I think a really interesting illustration, and again, of the literature's flaws in terms of thinking about private goods, public goods issues, is two works on Kenya. The first one, I think it's Ryan Briggs in World Politics several years ago. It was an analysis of how donor money is then targeted to specific constituencies by the ruling party in Kenya. And it was very, very clear that there was partisanship was playing the strongest role, that where MPs did the best job in terms of delivering the vote, or where they were in most need of a bit of support, foreign aid, even above and over the wishes of the donors, was targeted in those constituencies. So it's clearly a zero-sum money spent in one constituency can't be spent in another one, and partisanship is a huge role in that. At the same time, you're looking at Dan Posner's piece with Adam Harris. about what you do within the constituency. It's a totally different feature. I mean, I think the article is a bit oddly titled, because if you read it, what this really showing is that most MPs pay, when they come to distributing the CDF funds, play it fairly close to the vest, and they play it down the middle. And unless their supporters are heavily concentrated in one area, and there's very big voting margin differences between them and their opponents, they tend to put development projects, poverty alleviation projects in the areas in their districts where you would expect it, where the greatest need is, where the median voter lives. And it's very consistent with some of the arguments that Dan Young has made as well about just the size of the average African legislative district means that individual one-shot assistance to people in the old patron-client relationship simply is not strategically very useful. It may help public relations. You might want to do it just to make your name spread, but you can just get a lot bit more out of bringing a highway or a road or a post office into your constituency than to do a lot of one-shots, even hundreds or even maybe 1,000 individual gifts. It just doesn't get you that far. So I think those are the things that we need to think about in terms of getting a better grasp on what, of understanding money spent in constituencies, but in ways that can't be zoned off and excluded to your supporters, and that really are local public goods and not private goods.
Thank you, Bob. And finally, Carlos.
Yeah, thank you. Sure. Going for the first question. Yeah, when we look at the background or profile of MPs, we're going to see, of course, that they're out of touch elites. It's like, as Bob said, they tend to be much more educated, old male. Their occupational status tend to be manager, lawyers, or sociologists, or political scientists, things like that. So this is completely different from how the society looks like. The society is much more poor, uneducated things. So they are actually out of touch elite. When we look at the things that they do with their constituents, it's possible to say that regardless of being out of touch elites, they have some ties with the people that vote to them, because they need that relationship, as Anja put. In the case of Mozambique, on the indicators, orientation, and the policy preference, I have mixed findings. 2 of them shows that they're out of touch elites, and 2 of them shows that they're put up on servants. So yeah. The second question on what is the role of MPs? This is a little bit difficult, and it's also a dilemma when we look at lawmaking, oversight, and representation. We here are focusing much more on a representation of constituents to get to the conclusion whether they put up on servants or not, and we disregard other function or other roles of MPs, which are very important, lawmaking and oversight. But sometimes an MP can making laws and oversee the bureaucracy to better represent. So it's a little bit problematic when we just focus on the representation of constituent servants, and they say that, oh, because you are much more into lawmaking and oversight, you don't put up on servants, but sometimes I can make laws to better represent, I can oversee to better represent also the constituents. There's a question on, the MP service provision. There's that thing of variation where there's PR, electoral system count, or single member district. In the PR system it is in the chart, political parties play much more role. When MPs go to election campaign, they say, I can put road, but he's talking on behalf of his part or her part. It's not talking actually on his own behalf, because he doesn't have funding to build a road or bring a hospital. But in the case of Malawi, it's very interesting, because MPs, they pay for funeral, they give medicine if someone is in a hospital, is ill, or even take to hospital. So there's a few things that they provide service directly, regardless of having or not having money. There was a question on a chat, was on the tools to improve the relationship between citizens and MP. That could be constituent service program that exists in some countries, in some parliaments. Like the parliament is obliged to, mainly during interim periods, to deploy MPs back to their constituent. They pay, in Mozambican context, they pay per diem for them to go back for 30 days and they do some work there, whether they actually work with constituents or work for their political party, or they do other private business, something else. But constituent service program, it's something that the parliament can have as a tool to make citizens and MPs to come together. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Carlos. And thank you to all the speakers. We had a great show. And that is only because we had great speakers and an engaging audience. I want, on behalf of my colleagues at IDCPPA and Democracy in Africa, I would like to thank all of you, the speakers, for your fascinating insights, and also like to thank the audience for staying through what has been a very, very engaging and productive 2 hours discussion. Look forward to our next webinar next month, when we hopefully will be looking at the Angolan election. And I hope that you can join us then. But thank you so much for making the time today to join us. And thank you to our speakers.